والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما آمين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا ومرحبا بكم. I welcome you all back to our course on Safinat al-Naja, Imam al-Hadrami's primer in beginner Shafi'i jurisprudence or Islamic law. Alhamdulillah, having covered a number of topics thus far, we continue our pursuit of sacred knowledge in Kitab al-Tahara, again inshallah ta'ala, the book of cleanliness. And among the topics that we can seek in this particular subchapter of fiqh is the types of water, which we've dealt with, the ablution, which we've dealt with some of its aspects, and we will cover more of its aspects today, inshallah ta'ala. Then the causes of minor ritual impurity, which we are yet to deal with, using the lavatory, which basically covers najasa, and that was dealt with as well. Purificatory bathings or baths, in other words the ghusl, which we have covered as well. The dry ablution, which we are yet to cover. Menstruation, also still to be covered. And of course we've covered impurities. Now the basis for our discussion in relation to Kitab al-Tahara, there are many ayat of the Quran and a hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam that governs this particular bab. And among them we find the hadith that says, Miftahul Jannati as-Salah wa Miftahul Salati at-Tahur. The keys to paradise is the prayer, and the keys to the prayer are the processes of purification, or is purification. So Salah is the major factor in Islam, and among the major factors in Islam that will bring us Jannah, Salah is right at the top. And then in addition to that, in order to be successful in our prayer, we need to find success in the processes of purification that we follow in order to make our prayer valid. And this includes all of the subtopics that we've mentioned already. And inshallah ta'ala, we will continue with this trajectory. So in this lesson, we will deal with the 10 conditions of ablution or the 10 conditions of wudu, the 4 factors that nullify wudu, then the forbidden actions in a major state of ritual impurity, and forbidden actions in menses. So this is the contents for this particular lesson, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So having looked at a number of topics or subsections of Safinat al-Naja, we proceed to the next segment of text, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, which reads as follows. Fi shara'it al-wudu'i, regarding the conditions, the preconditions of the ablution. The word shara'it also appears in the form of a different plural, which is shurut. Shurutul wudu'i, the conditions of ablution. Asharatun are 10. There are 10 conditions of ablution, and they are as follows. Al-Islamu, that the person be a Muslim. Right? The person has to be a Muslim. This is generally going to be the condition for all forms of ibadat, that they are to be based upon Islam. So in other words, a person who does not fulfill the condition of Islam, they may do the external actions pertaining to that particular act, but it wouldn't be considered valid from them because it must be built upon the basis or the foundation of Islam. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. And then we proceed to the next one. Number 2, Imam al-Hadrami says, وَالتَّمْيِيزُ, the age of understanding, right? The age of understanding, because a child reaches the stage of understanding or mumayyiz. The word tamyiz means to distinguish. So tamyiz is a distinguishing factor. A child who reaches this particular age is called a mumayyiz. And this child is said to be at the age of discernment. And what this basically means, it's not puberty, it's not the age of reaching puberty that is referred to as baligh, But this here refers to a child being able to distinguish between right and wrong. Not that they always follow right and wrong, but they are able to distinguish between right and wrong. And also, the scholars have given another yardstick, which is that the child is able to, as you can see in the notes here, when they can eat, drink, and clean themselves after using the toilet unassisted. So generally speaking, even though there's no fixed age for the age of tamyiz, but generally speaking, we are looking at about the age of 7 or so, and Allah knows best. And then the next factor, وَالنِّقَاءُ عَنِ الْحَيْضِ وَالنِّفَاسِ, being free from that which prevents the water from reaching the skin. No, we skipped a step. Cleanliness from menstruation. وَالنِّقَاءُ, cleanliness, عَنِ الْحَيْضِ, from menstruation, وَالنِّفَاسِ, and postnatal or postpartum bleeding. So, in other words, what this is referring to is the menstruation, the natural menstruation that women experience. This takes place, as you know, once a month according to their cycle. And postpartum bleeding is the bleeding that a woman experiences after giving birth. So, in order for the validity of the wudu or the ablution to be in place, one needs to be free from both hayd as well as nifas. And then we proceed. وَأَمَّا, and from that which يَمْنَعُ, prevents, وُصُولَ الْمَاءِ, the reaching of the water, إِلَى الْبَشَرَةِ, to the skin. They also need to be free from that which prevents the reaching of water to the skin. So basically, this refers to not having any form of barrier. Now, there are different types of barriers. If the barrier is permeable, in other words, water can definitely permeate through that particular barrier, then such a barrier is not considered a preventative. But if there's a barrier that prevents the water from reaching the skin, then that would be a non-permeable barrier, and I'm sure there are other words that can also be used in relation to this. Then that would not nullify the wudu, but there wouldn't be a wudu in the first place because one of the conditions of wudu was not met adequately at that stage. So this is why scholars would look at things like henna. That henna is basically a natural form of dye that can be used on the skin or on the hair, and often women use it on the nails. So this creates a barrier, but it's not an impermeable barrier. Rather, it is a permeable barrier. The water can definitely reach through that and reach the skin underneath. And therefore, having something like henna will not block the wudu's validity. However, other non-permeable barriers such as conventional nail polish and paint or any form of oil for that matter, if it's on the skin, that would be an impermeable barrier. In other words, the water will not be able to penetrate that barrier in order to reach the skin, then that would prevent the validity of the wudu. It would prevent the wudu from taking place in the first place, which is why it is one of the conditions as mentioned here. And then furthermore, he says, وَأَلَّا يَكُونَ عَلَى الْعُدْوِ مَا يُغَيِّرُ الْمَاءَ. There should not be وَأَلَّا, and that not. So there's a built-in an here. وَأَنْ لَا, and that not. يَكُونَ, that there not be. عَلَى الْعُدْوِ, on the limb, meaning on the limb or limbs of ablution. مَا يُغَيِّرُ الْمَاءَ, that which would change the water. That which would change the water. So what we are referring to here, something on the limb that would change the water, could be anything. Of course, we're not referring to najasa here, but basically anything. So it could be, for example, some moisturizer or makeup, or what else would somebody have on their skin? Maybe some ointment and the like. So much so that there's a lot of it on the skin, that if you were to apply the water onto the skin, what's going to happen is that the water is no longer going to be water. It's going to be mixed with that particular item, and it wouldn't be called water at that time. So you're not washing yourself with purifying water, but you're rather washing yourself with water mixed with the substance to such an extent that you no longer call it water. So if that is the case, then this is a preventative for the validity of the wudu. the validity of the ablution, because now instead of, let's say you have a thick layer of sunscreen on, and you wash your limb in the usual way, taking a usual amount of water, as opposed to first washing the sunscreen off, then what's going to happen is that the water you are using for that wudu is going to be changed water, right? It's going to be water mixed with sunscreen to such an extent that the change is visible. So you're not washing yourself with purifying water, and this is something that would prevent the validity of ablution. So it's very easy to overcome. If you have any form of moisturizer or any form of substance application on your skin, then first remove the substance with a general wash or wipe or whatever it is required, and then proceed to taking a usual ablution, and bi'idhnillah, this will be sufficient as far as removing this preventative, and Allah knows best. And then we proceed, وَالْعِلْمُ بِفَرْضِيَّتِهِ, and knowledge of it, the wudu, being obligatory. Knowledge of it, the wudu, being obligatory. So what does this mean? This basically includes the idea of you must know that what you are doing is an obligation, because it is obligatory in order to perform the prayer. And thus, ما لا يتم الواجب إلا به فهو الواجب. That which the wajib cannot be completed except through it or with it is also wajib. And then of course we know that the wudu is obligatory in and of itself because of the various ahadith and ayat that are espousing this particular act of ibadah. And then following up from that, we see the author says, وَأَلَّا يَعْتَكِدَ فَرْضًا مِنْ فُرُوضِهِ سُنَّةً. وَأَلَّا يَعْتَكِدَ, the person should not believe فَرْضًا مِنْ فُرُوضِهِ, that one of its obligatory acts, sunnatan, is in fact a sunnah. So they shouldn't believe that. So what this requires is basically knowledge of sacred law. As you can see in the footnote, it says for the general public, it is sufficient, it's supposed to be, to know some of its acts are fard and some are sunnah. However, we should strive to learn sacred law in such a way that we are able to distinguish between the fard acts and the sunnah. And this is also very important in relation to our own practice of Islam, our personal practice of Islam. That should we ever be in a situation where we are unable to do the usual practice. So let's say, for example, you are constricted with your water usage or restricted with your water usage. You find yourself traveling or the like. You have some water, but you don't have a copious amount. You haven't reached your destination or whatever the case may be. So now, instead of performing every single act of the wudu, you try to limit your acts to only accommodate that which must be accommodated. So you would then be able to distinguish between what is fard, what is essential for the validity of the ablution, and what is a non-essential but praiseworthy act. So the differences between the fard and the sunnah. As the text states here, for the general public, it is sufficient to know that some of the acts of wudu are obligatory and others are sunnah. But the ideal is for a student of knowledge, one who pursues sacred law, to be able to distinguish between the fard acts and the sunnah acts, and Allah knows best. And then further, he says, وَالْمَاءُ الطَّهُورُ. And another condition is that the water that one uses be purifying water. Now notice the text says, the English text says pure water. However, the word in Arabic is at-tahur. And as you may know, the word for pure in Arabic is tahir, right? Tahir. But the word used to describe water that we can use to perform an ablution, or that we can use to perform a ghusl, or that we can use for istinja, or any religious purification process, such water is generally referred to as ma'un tahurun, purifying water. So what's the difference between tahir and tahur? We have dealt with this previously, but in a nutshell, tahur water is water found in its natural state. So basically water that has been unchanged, water that is in its natural state, whether that be from rainwater, tap water, lake water, river water, sea water, dam water, snow, hail, any water that comes from these sources that's in its natural state. Even if the water changes because of nature, so it forms some algae or the like, all that would be considered water in its natural state. What would then be considered pure water as opposed to tahur water? Pure water is basically going to fall into one of two categories. It's either water that has been mixed with a substance, not an impure substance, but some other substance that's pure, to such an extent that the water is no longer called water, it's called something else. So, for example, if you add coffee granules to water, to the extent that the water starts taking on a different color, then you no longer call that water, you call that, well, coffee, right? Or water that has been, stained by coffee, or Allah knows best. Another example of pure water, but not purifying water, is water that has already been used, right? Also known as ma'ul musta'mal. Water that has been used, in other words, it has already been used for a wudu, for a ghusl, or the like. As long as it is not contaminated with najasa, then such water is going to be considered pure, but not purifying. So then, knowing the distinction between purifying water and pure water, the question then comes in, so what's the benefit of having these categories if you can only use purifying water for processes of purification? And the answer is, well, while you can only use purifying water for processes of purification, you can still use pure water for other things, right? So, for example, washing your clothes, washing your dishes, right? You can use it for various other things. The only thing that you cannot use it for is processes of purification as far as the religion is concerned. So for this reason, there's a distinction between tahur water, purifying water, tahir water, pure water, and of course, najis water, water that has been contaminated, which cannot be used for basically anything except to try and purify it again by collecting a whole lot of that type of water together to the extent that it's more than 200 liters and there's no visible change in the color, taste, or smell of the water. Only then you can say that water can be used. Other than that, you cannot use impure water for basically anything, and Allah knows best. طيب. Then finally, there's another condition, but this is specifically for people who remain in a state of ritual impurity. So for somebody who suffers from incontinence, somebody who suffers from chronic vaginal bleeding or chronic flatulence or the like, so much so that there are special precautions and special procedures that they have to follow for them to be able to pray. This condition becomes valid. So what is it? Dukhulul waqt, the entering of the time of the prayer. The entering of the time of the prayer. In other words, the time of the specific prayer that they wish to purify themselves for must have already entered before they can proceed to purify themselves, because remember, such a person is in a constant state of impurification. So the idea is to give them the best chance to be pure for a particular fard prayer. So if it is that they need to purify themselves for Salatul Dhuhr, then they have to wait until the waqt of Dhuhr had entered before they proceed to purify themselves. And therefore, this is a condition for specifically this category of people. And then finally, وَالْمُوَالَاةُ لِدَائِمِ الْحَدَثِ, again attached to the previous condition, because it also specifically applied to those who are in a constant state of ritual impurification, such as the person in incontinence, chronic vaginal bleeding, etc. They should also observe succession, or quick succession rather, in washing the limbs of ablution. Why? Because they are da'im al-hadath, they are perpetually in a state of ritualistic impurity. So al-muwala, succession or quick succession, for a person without this ailment, or without this test of chronic impurity, such a person has to observe quick succession in washing their limbs. So they have to do all the fard parts of the wudu successively: the face, the arms, the head, the feet. They should not take any long pauses between these limbs, right? Especially these limbs. As for everyone else, if you don't have chronic issues of being in a state of impurity, then muwala or quick succession is a recommendation, and it is the appropriate behavior during ablution. In other words, so you should try to not successfully, but rather in quick succession, you should try to wash the limbs of wudu without taking an unnecessarily long pause between limbs. That's a recommendation. However, if anyone does take a long pause, even if it be an extended period of time, as long as they didn't do anything to invalidate the wudu or the parts of the wudu that they already have, then their wudu is still valid. In other words, quick succession is not a condition under normal circumstances for the validity of the wudu. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. طيب, so we can continue from there. So now we've covered what is referred to as the shurut or the shara'it, the conditions of ablution, the factors that we need to ensure are in place before we engage in the act of ablution itself. So let's briefly cover that again. They are Islam, being of the age of understanding. Just one more note about being of the age of understanding is that it's not that a child who is younger than this age cannot take ablution. It's just that a child younger than this age should, of course, be assisted by his or her parents in order to make sure that they're doing what they need to do. Also, important to note is that this is not saying that the child at the age of distinction is duty bound to take wudu or to perform salah. They are not duty bound. This would be part of their training, because the Prophet ﷺ said, "Muru awladakum bis salati wa hum abna'u sab'i sinin, واضربوهم عليها وهم أبناء 10 سنين وفرقوا بينهم في المضاجع." أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. He said, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, command your children with prayer when they are 7 years of age, and give them a light hiding when they are of 10 years of age. Of course, child abuse is completely impermissible in Islam. A light hiding, a light punishment, discipline them, in other words. When they are 10 years of age, in other words, become a bit more serious about it. And then also, وَفَرِّقُوا بَيْنَهُمْ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ, and separate between them as far as beds are concerned, so they shouldn't be sleeping in the same beds. So this is like a yardstick for all other forms of ibadah. So we know that children are not mukallaf, in other words, they are not duty bound by sacred law until they reach the age of bulugh, until they reach the age of puberty, and they have sanity as well. So this is not saying that the wudu is obligatory upon them, but rather this is saying that in order for a child to take a proper wudu by themselves, they need to at least be at the age of discrimination or discernment. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. And so we've noted Islam, the age of understanding, then cleanliness from menstruation or postnatal bleeding, being free from that which prevents the water from reaching the skin. Nothing should be upon the limb that will change the qualities of the ablution, or the qualities of the water rather. Knowledge of the wudu or ablution being obligatory. Not to assume the fard or obligatory acts as sunnah or recommended acts. That purifying water be used. And then number 9 and 10, which are conditions specifically for those in a state of perpetual impurity. It is the knowledge of the entering of the waqt, the entering of the time of prayer, and quick succession, as you can see in the translation here, continuity for a person constantly in the state of impurity. In other words, quick succession of the limbs and no breaks in between washing those limbs, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. طيب. So this concludes the shurut of wudu. We can now proceed on to the next segment of text, inshallah ta'ala, which deals with which are the factors that break the ablution, right? So this is an important one, because without knowing what breaks the ablution, you would constantly be left with doubts or questions about, did this break my wudu? Did that break my wudu? So the way we study sacred law, especially from a beginner's perspective, a beginner would have a million questions, because every single action imaginable is a potential question about what breaks the wudu, for example. So, for example, somebody would be able to say, does speaking with foul language break the wudu? Does lying break the wudu? Does abusive language break the wudu? Does smoking break the wudu? Etc. So every single action imaginable is a question. So the way we study fiqh is to follow the system of fiqh, which is for everything we learn, there are going to be shurut, which are conditions. There are going to be wajibat, or obligatory acts. There are going to be sunan, recommended acts. And then there may be makruh acts, disliked acts. And there may be haram acts. So once you've studied the list of conditions, of integrals, of recommendations, etc., then essentially what should happen is that all of your potential questions should be answered automatically. So in the case of wudu, for example, we've learned what are the obligatory acts of wudu. We've learned what are the conditions of wudu. Now we are going to learn which are the factors that nullify the ablution. Once we know this, then we should be able to answer not other people's questions, because inshallah we are not muftis, but our own questions. As far as does this break the wudu, does that break the wudu, we should be confident in knowing what does and does not break one's ablution, at least according to the Shafi'i school. So let us see that. And then after that, inshallah, we can put our questions to the test and see, do we still have questions about what breaks the wudu or not? Hopefully, inshallah, we should receive some clarity herein, and Allah knows best. So the segment reads, Faslun, section, Fi nawaqid al-wudu'i, in those matters, nawaqid, that nullify or break, from the word naqada, which means to break. So nawaqid is the plural. The nullifiers, al-wudu'i, mudafun ilay, wudu'i, the nullifiers of ablution. The nullifiers of ablution. And as you can see from the translation section, the factors that nullify the wudu, and he says, are four. Where do we get that from? From the next line. Nawaqidul wudu'i, the nullifiers of ablution, arba'atun, or rather arba'atu ashiya'a. There are four factors, four ashiya'a, things. Nawaqidul wudu'i, the nullifiers of ablution, arba'atu ashiya'a, are four factors or four things. So now we already know that the things or the actions, according to the Shafi'i school, which break the ablution are four. Not five, not six, not less than four, but they are four. So once we learn these four, then inshallah we'll be very confident as to what breaks the ablution and what does not break the ablution. And it's also important that when we learn as a beginner, that we allow all of our misconceptions that we may have had about any of the sacred law elements, that we allow them to dissipate as they should rightfully do, because that's the nature of knowledge. When the light comes, the darkness goes away. So if we had any misconceptions about what breaks the wudu and what doesn't, then inshallah when we learn from an authentic source and from a teacher what does break the wudu, then we should let go of the matters that we wrongfully assumed breaks the wudu, and Allah knows best. So what are they? To make it brief, so we'll briefly mention the four and then we'll go through them one by one. Number one, anything that exits from the two private parts. Number two, a lapse in one's intellect or state of consciousness. Number three, the skin of a marriageable man touching the skin of a marriageable woman. And number four, touching human private parts with the insides of one's hands. Those are the four factors that break the wudu according to the Shafi'i school. And now we can look at each one of them in greater detail, inshallah ta'ala. So number one, we said al-khariju, that which exits, min ahadis sabilain, from one of the two pathways, min kubulin, from the front private part, aw duburin, or the rear private part, rihun, whether it be wind, aw ghayruhu, or anything else, illa al-mani, except for sperm, which is an exception to the rule. So sperm is not counted as something that breaks the wudu. Now, this is something that confuses many Shafi'i students, so I'll try to clarify it up front, inshallah ta'ala. The practical application of this is practically zero. The practical application of this is practically zero. In other words, if sperm exits the front private part of a male or female and they had wudu, from a fiqh perspective, the sperm doesn't break the wudu. But there's nothing that they can do as far as wudu is concerned. They can't make salah, they can't touch the Quran, etc. Why? Because they are required to perform a fard or ghusl, right? So the wudu that they may have had is not going to be of any benefit because there's no ghusl. So then the question obviously arises, so what's the point of making this an exception? The point is that Imam Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala specifically wanted to give the human the status that the human deserves based on the text from the Quran and the Sunnah of how Allah Ta'ala had honored the children of Adam. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam. We had honored the children of Adam. So the origin of the human cannot be considered as najasa in the Shafi'i school, nor can it be considered a factor that breaks the wudu. So there's no practical application, but so that the status of the honor of a human being is reflected in sacred law, this is why we find it included in this way. So don't let it confuse you. Just understand that it has its place in that sense. Everything else will go according to the normal rulings, and Allah knows best. So let's look at it again. Anything that al-khariju exits min ahadis sabilain, from either of the two pathways, meaning the two private parts. Min kubulin aw duburin, front private part or rear private part. Rihun aw ghayruhu, whether it be a wind or anything else. So a wind, a stone, a worm, a bubble, or the usual stuff like human urine or excrement, etc. Anything coming through those pathways would instantaneously nullify the ablution according to the Shafi school, and that's the first point. So let's look at it from the English note and see if we can find any useful notes here. Number one, anything that exits from either the front or the rear private parts, whether wind or anything else, except semen. Then he says, or anything else, whether common or uncommon, such as a worm or stone, but not mani, not semen. An example of this being someone firmly... Okay, no, this is a separate footnote. But this is going to show you like the minimum type of practical application that it may have. An example of this being someone firmly seated who sleeps and has a wet dream, or someone who looks at something lustfully and sperm or sexual fluid emitted. So in other words, such a person, let's say it's a man, he hasn't engaged in physical intimacy, or he's not married, let's say he's not married, and he happens to see, by accident, he sees an attractive woman, and his lustful thoughts runs away with him. He tries to look away, etc. It doesn't work. Rather, he tries to look away. He manages to look away, but the thought or the vision of the attractive woman is still in his mind, and he releases semen. He ejaculates. So in this case, he was in a wakeful state. He didn't do anything else that nullifies the wudu. So technically, he still has ablution. But what did we say? The practical value of this is practically zero, because he cannot do anything now. He cannot go and pray salah. He cannot go and read Quran, etc. Why? Because he is not in a state of ghusl, because this automatically breaks the ghusl. So again, it can be confusing if you allow it to be confusing, and it can be quite simple if you allow it to be simple, which is basically that this is the Shafi'i madhab's way of honoring the status of the human being, but there's no real practical application to this, and Allah knows best. We move on to the second factor that breaks the wudu. What did we say? In revision, we said the first one, anything that exits the front or the rear private part. The second one, a lapse of intellect or state of consciousness, right? Number three, we said it is the skin touching marriageable skin. In other words, the skin of a man touching the skin of a marriageable female. And number four, touching a human private part or the insides of one's hands. Those are the four factors. We spoke about number one. Let's look at number two. Zawalul aqli, the lapse or removal or pause of one's intellect, binawmin, whether that be through sleep, or ghayrihi, or any other form, with one exception. إلا نوم قاعد ممكن مقعدته من الأرض. There's one exception to this, and that exception is someone who sleeps قاعد, the sleep of a sitting person, ممكن مقعدته, whose buttocks or behind is firmly seated من الأرض, on the surface of whatever they are sitting on. So in other words, basically what this is saying is anyone whose intellect leaves them for a moment, whether they fall asleep, whether they become unconscious, whether they go through some form of anesthetic, whether they go through some form of trauma, or they go into a semi, what's the word? A temporary coma, etc. Anything that removes one's state of consciousness, even for a moment, that automatically nullifies the ablution. The exception to this is if somebody sleeps seated, whether they are seated in a car or a plane or on the ground, whether they are seated with their backs against the wall, the backs against the chair, it doesn't make a difference. As long as both sides of the behind, both sides of the rear, the posterior, the buttock, both sides of that is firmly planted on the surface that they are sitting on and has not removed from that surface for a second or for a moment, then their wudu is still considered intact. So somebody could literally be sleeping, be fast asleep, be completely knocked out, and he could sleep, for an extended period of time, as long as he remains seated in the upright position, or I shouldn't say the upright position, but rather he remains seated in such a way that his behind is firmly planted on the ground. Because he doesn't need to be upright. He could even be inclining slightly to the back. He could even be inclining slightly to the side. The only condition is that neither of his two sides of his behind should lift up from the ground. Even if it is a moment, then that would nullify the ablution. So the second condition, once again, is zawalul aqli, the removal or the lapse or the pause in one's intellect, one's consciousness, whether that be through sleep or any other form, except if one sleeps firmly planted on the surface one is seated on, with both sides of the buttocks remaining firmly planted. So that was number 2. So what was number 1? Number 1 is anything that exits the front or the rear private parts. Okay. Number 2 is the pause or lapse in one's consciousness. And of course we mentioned an exception. And then now we are busy with number 3. Number 3 is the touching of skin to skin, of a man to a marriageable woman. Right? That's number 3. And then number 4 is the touching of human private parts. And I'm doing all 4 as a review